If you're lying awake right now, struggling to quiet your racing mind, you're about to discover something that might surprise you. Tonight, we're going to explore why a single day in medieval times would probably be the end of you, but told in the most soothing, sleep-inducing way possible. No jump scares, no sudden drama, just the gentle reality of how incredibly difficult life was 700 years ago and why you should feel grateful for your warm bed and modern conveniences. Over the next few hours, we'll walk through a complete day in the year 1347, experiencing the countless ways that medieval life would challenge, overwhelm, and quite possibly defeat even the strongest modern person. This isn't about heroes or adventures, it's about the mundane, everyday struggles that made simply surviving another day a remarkable achievement. By the way, if this helps you fall asleep tonight, make sure to subscribe to Past Bedtime. We create historical sleep stories regularly, and our growing community of insomniacs from around the world can tell you these gentle journeys through history really work. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Whether it's 2 a.m. in Chicago, midnight in Manchester, or 3 a.m. in Melbourne, you're part of our global family of fellow night owls finding peace through history. So settle into your comfortable bed, adjust your pillow, and let yourself drift into a world where your biggest daily challenge wasn't your alarm clock or morning coffee, but simply making it through another day alive. Now, let's begin our gentle exploration of why medieval times would probably defeat you before breakfast. It's still dark when consciousness begins to creep into your medieval mind. There are no gentle alarm clocks here, no snooze buttons to grant you those precious extra minutes of rest. Instead, you're awakened by the sound that governed medieval life more than any king or lord ever could, the church bell, ringing through the pre-dawn darkness with a persistence that would make your modern phone alarm seem polite by comparison. But here's the first thing that would probably surprise you about medieval mornings. You're not waking up in some drafty, freezing hovel like the movies suggest. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people understood insulation quite well. Your bed, if you're fortunate enough to be anything above the lowest peasant class, is actually surrounded by heavy curtains, thick wool hangings that trap your body heat and create a surprisingly warm microclimate around your sleeping area. Medieval people were actually cleaner than you think. This is one of the most persistent myths about medieval life that needs to be addressed right from the start. The idea that medieval people were dirty, smelly, and didn't care about hygiene is largely a creation of later periods trying to make themselves seem more civilized by comparison. In reality, medieval people bathed regularly, understood the importance of clean clothes, and took great care with personal hygiene within the constraints of their technology and resources. The bed itself would feel strange beneath your modern body. Instead of a mattress as we know it, you're lying on a straw-filled tick, a large cloth bag stuffed with whatever organic material was available, straw, feathers if you're wealthy, or even just dried leaves and moss if you're not. Over this, several layers of wool blankets, some surprisingly soft and well-made. Medieval textile work was far more sophisticated than most people realize. The wealthy had beds that would surprise modern people with their comfort and luxury. Feather mattresses, silk sheets, elaborate bed curtains that could cost more than a peasant's entire annual income. Even middle-class merchants and skilled craftsmen had beds that were comfortable by any reasonable standard. The stereotype of medieval people sleeping on bare straw in cold, drafty rooms is largely inaccurate for anyone above the very bottom of the social hierarchy. But as you shift in this unfamiliar bed, the first real challenge of medieval life begins to make itself known. Your body, accustomed to modern hygiene and sanitation, is already beginning to react to the environment around you. The straw in your mattress, no matter how carefully prepared, harbors insects. Fleas are jumping onto your skin as you move, and the sensation would be immediately noticeable to someone used to pest-free sleeping arrangements. This isn't necessarily due to poor cleanliness, it's the simple reality that in a world without modern pest control, certain creatures were simply part of life. Medieval people had numerous strategies for dealing with fleas, lice, and other pests. They used aromatic herbs, frequently changed bedding, and maintained cleanliness as much as possible. But complete elimination of these pests was simply not possible with medieval technology. The herbs used for pest control would actually be pleasant to modern senses. Lavender, mint, rosemary, and other fragrant plants were commonly used in bedding and clothing to repel insects. Many medieval beds smelled quite lovely, filled with dried flowers and herbs that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. As you lie there in the pre-dawn darkness, trying to process the unfamiliar sensations, you become aware of sounds that would be completely foreign to a modern ear. The house itself is making noises, not the familiar hum of electrical appliances or the whisper of central heating, but the organic sounds of a structure made entirely of wood, thatch, and stone responding to temperature changes and moisture. There's a constant, subtle creaking as wooden beams expand and contract. The sound of small animals moving in the thatch roof above you, mice, perhaps even rats, but also birds and insects that make the roof their home. This isn't a sign of a poorly maintained house, it's simply the reality of buildings that are essentially part of the natural world rather than sealed off from it. Medieval builders were actually quite skilled at creating structures that were both durable and comfortable. Many medieval buildings that still stand today are testaments to the skill of their builders. The integration with the natural world wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Buildings were designed to work with natural materials and processes rather than against them. The smell would hit you next, and this might be one of the most challenging aspects for a modern person to adjust to. It's not that medieval homes were filthy. Remember, these people valued cleanliness, but the odors are entirely different from what we're accustomed to. There's the smell of the straw mattress, earthy and organic. The scent of wool that hasn't been treated with modern chemicals, giving it a distinctly animal-like aroma. With smoke from fires that never quite die completely, creating a perpetual backdrop of smokiness that permeates everything. And underneath it all, the smell of humanity itself. In a world without deodorants, synthetic fragrances, or modern laundry detergents, human scent is much more present. Not necessarily unpleasant, medieval people had their own ways of managing body odor, using herbs and frequent washing, but intensely human in a way that would be immediately noticeable to someone from our sanitized modern world. Medieval people used a variety of natural deodorants and perfumes. Rosewater was popular among the wealthy, while common people used herbs like mint and thyme. Both men and women paid attention to their scent, and pleasant-smelling individuals were considered attractive and socially desirable. As you become more aware of your surroundings, you'd notice that you're not alone in this room. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed in medieval times. Unless you're nobility of the highest order, you're sharing this space with family members, servants, or fellow workers. The sounds of other people breathing, shifting in their sleep, occasionally murmuring or snoring would be a constant presence. This communal sleeping arrangement served multiple purposes beyond simple space efficiency. In a world without central heating, shared body heat was a practical necessity for survival during cold months. The presence of others also provided security both from potential human threats and from the very real dangers posed by fire, which could consume an entire wooden structure in minutes. But for a modern person accustomed to private bedrooms and personal space, this constant presence of others would be immediately unsettling. The inability to simply lie in bed and process your thoughts privately, the need to be constantly aware of others' presence and comfort would add a layer of social complexity to the simple act of waking up that most of us have never experienced. The darkness itself would be different from any darkness you've known in the modern world. This isn't the darkness of a room with blackout curtains and electronics casting tiny LED glows. This is complete, absolute darkness broken only by the faintest possible light source, perhaps the dying embers of a banked fire, or a single small candle if fuel is available and the risk of fire is deemed acceptable. Your eyes, accustomed to the constant low-level light pollution of modern life, would struggle to adjust. The darkness would feel thick, almost tangible, in a way that would be disorienting and possibly frightening. Every sound would seem amplified, every small movement would feel uncertain and potentially dangerous. Medieval people developed remarkable night vision compared to modern people. Living in environments with much less artificial light, their eyes adapted to function better in low-light conditions. They could navigate their homes and communities in darkness that would leave modern people completely helpless. And then there's the cold. Even in the relatively protected environment of a curtained bed, the cold would be a constant presence. Medieval heating was a constant battle against the elements, and it was a battle that was never completely won. Your breath would be visible in the air, your body would instinctively curl into itself seeking warmth, and the simple act of emerging from under the covers would require genuine courage. The cold affects everything in ways that modern people rarely consider. It makes your muscles stiff and slow to respond. It affects your thinking, making you sluggish and less alert. It forces you to make constant calculations about energy expenditure. Is it worth moving to adjust your position, or should you stay still to preserve heat? Every action becomes a deliberate choice rather than an automatic response. Medieval people developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with cold that modern people have largely forgotten. They understood layering, they knew how to use their body heat efficiently, and they had developed clothing and bedding that was remarkably effective at insulation. But the cold was still a constant presence that shaped every aspect of daily life. As the church bell continues its relentless calling, you begin to understand that there's no option to ignore it. In medieval society, the rhythm of religious observance wasn't optional or separate from daily life. It was the framework within which everything else existed. That bell isn't just calling people to prayer, it's announcing the official beginning of the workday, the opening of markets, the start of legal proceedings, and countless other activities that depend on synchronized timing. Your modern body, accustomed to choosing when to wake up based on personal schedules and preferences, would rebel against this external control. The psychological impact of having your sleep and wake cycle determined by forces completely outside your control would be immediately apparent. There's no negotiating with a church bell, no 5-minute grace period, no option to sleep in because you stayed up late or don't feel well. This external control extends beyond just the timing of waking up. As you lie there in the darkness, trying to gather the courage to leave your warm bed, you begin to realize that almost every aspect of the coming day will be determined by forces outside your control. The weather will dictate what work can be done. The season will determine what food is available. The social hierarchy will control whom you can speak to and how. Religious obligations will structure your schedule. Economic necessities will drive most of your choices. For a modern person accustomed to having dozens of choices about everything from breakfast options to entertainment preferences, this lack of personal autonomy would be psychologically challenging in ways that might not be immediately obvious but would create a constant, low-level stress throughout the day. The bed curtains around you, which initially seemed like a comfort, would begin to feel confining as you fully wake up. They trap not just heat, but also the accumulated breath and body odor of everyone sleeping in the enclosed space. The air inside your little cloth cocoon would be stuffy and humid, thick with exhaled carbon dioxide and moisture from breathing. But leaving this protective enclosure means immediate exposure to the harsh realities of medieval morning air. The temperature difference between inside and outside the bed curtains could easily be 20 or 30 degrees. Your warm skin would be hit with cold air that would make you gasp and shiver uncontrollably. And unlike modern homes where you can adjust the temperature with a thermostat, the cold in a medieval dwelling is a fixed reality that must be endured rather than controlled. The fire that provided heat the night before has likely died down to barely glowing embers. Restarting it will require skill, patience, and precious fuel. Until that fire is rebuilt and begins to warm the room, you'll be living in temperatures that would be considered uncomfortable even in modern buildings during winter. Your feet, when they first touch the floor, would encounter another shock that modern people rarely experience. Instead of carpet, hardwood, or even cold tile, you'd be stepping onto packed earth, stone, or rough wooden planks. These surfaces hold cold like thermal mass, staying chilled long after the air temperature begins to rise. Walking barefoot would be immediately uncomfortable, potentially painful, and would quickly draw heat from your body through direct contact. The search for appropriate footwear would present its own challenges. Medieval shoes were quite different from modern ones. They were often soft-soled, providing little insulation from ground temperature, and they were frequently not left and right specific, meaning they could be worn on either foot but provided less precise fit and comfort than modern shoes. Medieval footwear was actually quite sophisticated, though different from modern shoes. Leather was carefully treated and shaped, and shoes were designed to be durable and protective. The wealthy had shoes that were both functional and fashionable, with elaborate decorations and high-quality materials. Getting dressed in medieval clothing would be a process that would surprise most modern people with its complexity and time requirements. Contrary to the simple peasant garb often shown in movies, medieval clothing was typically layered, fitted, and required assistance or significant time to put on properly. The undergarments alone would be unfamiliar. Medieval people wore linen underclothes that were designed to be washable while the outer garments were not. These undergarments were often quite sophisticated, well-fitted, comfortable, and designed to provide warmth and protection for the skin. But putting them on in a cold room would be an ordeal in itself, requiring you to expose your skin to frigid air while fumbling with unfamiliar fastenings and ties. The outer garments would be even more challenging. Medieval clothing was designed for durability and warmth rather than convenience. Many garments required lacing or tying that was difficult or impossible to do alone. The heavy fabrics, while excellent for insulation, would be stiff and unwieldy when cold, making them difficult to manipulate with fingers that were already becoming numb from the temperature. Medieval clothing was actually quite beautiful and well-made. Even peasant clothing was often dyed in attractive colors and decorated with embroidery or other embellishments. People took pride in their appearance and dressed as well as their circumstances allowed. The idea that medieval people wore only brown, shapeless garments is another persistent myth. As you struggle with unfamiliar clothing in the cold darkness, listening to the persistent calling of the church bell and the sounds of others beginning to stir, you'd start to understand that you haven't even faced the real challenges of medieval life yet. This is still the protected indoor environment. You haven't yet stepped outside into weather that could be genuinely life-threatening, haven't yet tried to find and prepare food, haven't yet navigated the complex social hierarchies that governed medieval interaction. The simple act of getting dressed and ready to face the day, something that takes minutes in the modern world, would already be testing your physical comfort, your patience, and your psychological resilience in ways that would give you a preview of the challenges ahead. And all of this is assuming you woke up healthy. In medieval times, minor illnesses that we barely notice today could be genuinely dangerous. A simple cold could develop into pneumonia without modern medicine to support your immune system. A small cut could become infected and life-threatening without antibiotics. Even something as simple as a headache or upset stomach could significantly impact your ability to perform the physical labor that medieval life demanded. Your modern immune system, despite its advantages in some areas, would be completely unprepared for the bacterial and viral environment of medieval life. Diseases that medieval people had developed some resistance to through generations of exposure would hit you with full force. The simple act of breathing the air, touching surfaces, or eating food would expose you to pathogens that your body has never encountered and has no defenses against. But even setting aside the disease risks, your modern body would be fundamentally unsuited to medieval physical demands. Most modern people, even those who exercise regularly, are not prepared for the constant physical labor that medieval life required. Our muscles are adapted for different types of movement, our cardiovascular systems are trained for different types of exertion, and our joints and bones are accustomed to different stresses. As you finally manage to get dressed and prepare to face the day, you'd be beginning to understand that the medieval world wasn't just different from ours, it was different in ways that would challenge every assumption you have about daily life, personal autonomy, physical comfort, and even basic survival. The door of your medieval dwelling is not like any door you've ever encountered in the modern world. It's thick, heavy, made of solid wood planks bound together with iron bands, and it moves on hinges that were forged by hand in a local smithy. Opening it requires genuine physical effort, and the sound it makes, a deep, wooden groaning accompanied by the squeak of metal hinges that have never known modern lubricants, would announce your emergence to anyone within hearing distance. But before you can even reach for the door handle, which itself is a simple iron latch that would be cold enough to sting your fingers, you'd need to navigate the interior space of your medieval home. And this journey alone would present challenges that modern people rarely consider. The floor beneath your feet would be uneven in ways that would immediately challenge your balance and walking patterns. Medieval floors were not the precisely level surfaces we take for granted. Even in relatively wealthy homes, floors were made of packed earth, rough stone, or wooden planks that had settled and warped over time. Every step would require attention and care to avoid stumbling or catching your foot on raised edges or in small depressions. In dimmer lighting conditions, and medieval interiors were always dimly lit compared to modern standards, this uneven terrain would be genuinely treacherous. Your modern reflexes and muscle memory are calibrated for predictable, level surfaces. The constant micro-adjustments required to navigate medieval floors would tire your legs and feet in ways you've never experienced, and the mental attention required to watch every step would be mentally exhausting. The low ceiling beams that were common in medieval construction would present another constant challenge. These heavy wooden beams, often less than 6 feet from the floor, would pose a continuous threat to your head and shoulders. Medieval people, who were generally shorter than modern people and who grew up in these environments, developed an unconscious awareness of ceiling height that allowed them to move naturally without injury. But for a modern person, especially one of average height or taller, these beams would represent a constant hazard. The psychological effect of low ceilings cannot be underestimated. They create a sense of confinement and claustrophobia that would be immediately noticeable to someone accustomed to modern ceiling heights. The feeling of being unable to stand fully upright, of having to constantly duck and weave to avoid obstacles, would create a stress response that would persist throughout your time indoors. Medieval furniture would present its own navigation challenges. Tables, chairs, and storage chests were typically heavier and bulkier than modern furniture made from solid wood with iron reinforcements. They were also arranged differently. Medieval rooms served multiple purposes, so furniture was often placed in configurations that maximized space utilization rather than ease of movement. The lighting situation would be perhaps the most immediately disorienting aspect of the medieval interior environment. Even during daylight hours, medieval homes were dim compared to modern standards. Windows were small, often shuttered, and glass was expensive and rare. Most light came from openings that were designed primarily for ventilation, with light being a secondary consideration. Candles and oil lamps provided additional illumination, but these were precious commodities that were used sparingly. The light they provided was warm and flickering, creating moving shadows that would make navigation even more challenging. Your eyes, accustomed to the bright, steady illumination of modern lighting, would struggle to adapt to these conditions. The quality of light in medieval homes was actually quite beautiful, though challenging. The warm, golden light from candles and fires created an intimate atmosphere that many people find more pleasant than harsh electric lighting. But this beauty came at the cost of functionality. Detailed work was difficult, reading was a strain, and moving around safely required constant attention. As you make your way toward the door, you become aware of the medieval approach to storage and organization. Instead of built-in closets and cabinets, medieval homes used chests, baskets, and hanging systems for storage. Personal belongings were kept in wooden chests that also served as seating and tables. Clothes were stored in these chests with aromatic herbs to prevent moth damage and provide pleasant scents. This storage system meant that getting anything required opening heavy lids, moving other items around, and often kneeling or bending in ways that would be uncomfortable for someone not used to this system. The simple task of finding a particular item could take several minutes and require significant physical effort. The medieval approach to personal possessions was fundamentally different from modern consumer culture. People owned far fewer items, but each item was more carefully made, more valuable, and more carefully maintained. A single garment might represent weeks of work and significant expense. This created a relationship with material objects that was much more intimate and respectful than most modern people experience. Finally reaching the door, you'd need to deal with the medieval security system. Doors were secured with heavy wooden bars, complex iron locks, or simple but effective latching mechanisms. These security measures were necessary. Medieval communities faced real threats from bandits, political conflicts, and social unrest that made home security a serious concern. The door itself would be surprisingly heavy. Without modern materials like aluminum or lightweight composites, medieval doors were made from solid wood planks several inches thick. The weight would be immediately noticeable when you tried to open it, and the effort required would be significant, especially if your muscles were already fatigued from the cold and the stress of adapting to the medieval environment. When you finally managed to open the door and step outside, the sensory assault would be immediate and overwhelming. The first thing that would hit you is the air itself, thick with smoke from countless fires, heavy with organic smells that modern air filtration has trained us to forget, and filled with sounds that would be completely foreign to modern ears. The smoke comes from everywhere: cooking fires, heating fires, metalworking forges, and various craft activities that require flame. In a medieval community, fire is constantly present, and the smoke from these fires creates a permanent haze that hangs over everything. Your modern lungs, accustomed to relatively clean air, would immediately react to the smoky environment with coughing and irritation. But here's something that might surprise you. Despite the smoke and smells, medieval outdoor air was actually much cleaner than modern urban air in many ways. There were no industrial pollutants, no automotive emissions, no chemical contamination from modern manufacturing. The air was full of natural scents and organic particles, but it was free from the synthetic chemicals that modern people breathe every day. The sounds of a medieval morning would be unlike anything you've ever experienced. Instead of the mechanical hum of modern life, cars, air conditioning, electrical equipment, you'd hear the sounds of human and animal activity. Roosters crowing, pigs grunting, dogs barking, and horses snorting. People calling to each other across distances, the sound of wooden tools striking wood and stone, the creak of cart wheels on rough roads. These sounds would seem almost overwhelmingly loud after the relative quiet of the indoor environment. Medieval people lived with a constant background of animal and human noise that modern people would find distracting and stressful. Privacy wasn't just rare indoors, it was virtually non-existent outdoors as well. The visual landscape would be immediately jarring to modern eyes. Medieval communities were built on a completely different aesthetic than modern ones. Buildings were organic in shape, following the contours of the land and the availability of materials rather than conforming to geometric plans. Roads were unpaved paths that wound around obstacles rather than cutting straight lines through the landscape. Everything would look rough and handmade compared to the precision of modern construction. There would be no straight lines, no perfect right angles, no uniform surfaces. This organic quality would be beautiful in its own way, but it would also create a sense of chaos and unpredictability that might be unsettling to someone accustomed to the ordered regularity of modern environments. The smells outside would be intense and varied. Cooking food, animal waste, human waste, wood smoke, leather, metal, and dozens of other organic scents would create a complex olfactory environment that would be immediately noticeable and potentially overwhelming. Medieval people had much more sensitive noses than modern people. They could identify individuals by scent, determine the health of animals by smell, and navigate their environment using olfactory cues that modern people have forgotten how to interpret. You'd probably die from the water, not the plague. This is another surprising fact about medieval life that contradicts popular assumptions. While the Black Death and other plagues certainly killed millions of people, contaminated water was actually a much more consistent and immediate threat to daily survival. Medieval communities had sophisticated understanding of some aspects of water quality. They knew that water from certain sources was safer than others. They had methods for improving water through settling and filtration. And they often preferred beer and wine not just for pleasure but because the brewing process made these beverages safer than water. But despite this knowledge, medieval water sources were constantly contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and other pathogens that would be immediately dangerous to someone with a modern immune system. The simple act of drinking water, something modern people do without thought, would be a calculated risk every single time. The water supply system itself would be completely foreign to modern experience. Instead of turning a handle and getting clean, treated water, you'd need to walk to a well, spring, or stream. This water source might be shared with animals, might be downstream from human waste disposal, and would certainly contain microorganisms that your body has never encountered. Drawing water from a well would be physical work that modern people are not prepared for. Medieval wells were deep, and hauling up a bucket of water required significant arm and back strength. The bucket itself would be heavy even when empty, and when full of water, it would require careful technique to lift without injury. The water, when you finally obtained it, would taste different from anything you're accustomed to. Natural water has flavors that modern treatment removes, mineral tastes, organic flavors, and sometimes unpleasant notes that indicate contamination. Medieval people developed palates that could detect these flavor differences and use them to assess water safety, but to modern taste buds, even safe medieval water would taste strange and possibly unpleasant. Even if you managed to avoid drinking contaminated water, you'd still need water for washing, and this would present its own challenges. Medieval people understood the importance of cleanliness, but the process of getting clean was labor-intensive and required careful planning. Heating water for washing required fuel, time, and attention. Wood or other combustible materials had to be gathered, fires had to be built and maintained, and water had to be heated slowly to avoid waste. The modern practice of taking long, hot showers would be impossible both because of resource constraints and because the infrastructure simply didn't exist. Medieval bathing, when it occurred, was often a social activity. Public bathhouses existed in many communities, and private bathing often involved family members or servants helping with the process. The idea of private, individual bathing would be foreign and potentially wasteful in a society where resources like fuel and hot water were precious. Personal hygiene items would be completely different from modern products. Soap existed but was often harsh and made from animal fats and lye. Tooth cleaning was done with cloths, salt, or primitive toothbrushes made from twigs. Hair care involved combs made from wood or bone, and hair washing was done with various herbal preparations that might or might not be effective. As you stand outside your medieval dwelling, trying to process the overwhelming sensory experience of a medieval morning, you begin to realize that every basic activity you take for granted in modern life, getting clean water, maintaining personal hygiene, staying warm and dry, would require significant effort, planning, and physical work in the medieval world. The social aspects of medieval morning life would begin to assert themselves as you became aware of other people moving around the community. Medieval society was intensely hierarchical, and every interaction was governed by complex rules of social precedence, respect, and obligation that would be completely foreign to modern sensibilities. Even something as simple as greeting a neighbor would require knowledge of social protocols that you wouldn't possess. The wrong word, gesture, or tone of voice could have serious social consequences. Medieval communities were small and tightly knit, meaning that social mistakes would be remembered and could affect your status and relationships for years. The clothing that people wore immediately indicated their social status, occupation, and wealth in ways that would be immediately obvious to medieval eyes but completely opaque to modern ones. The color, quality, and style of fabric, the presence or absence of certain decorative elements, even the way garments were worn, all conveyed detailed social information that everyone in the community could read instantly. Your modern clothing, if you were somehow wearing it, would mark you immediately as a foreign outsider. The synthetic fabrics, precise manufacturing, and modern styling would be so obviously different from medieval garments that you would attract attention and suspicion wherever you went. The pace of medieval morning life would be both faster and slower than modern mornings in different ways. There was no rushing to catch public transportation or arrive at an office by a specific time, but there was also no time to waste. Every daylight hour was precious, and the amount of work that needed to be accomplished each day to maintain survival was enormous. Medieval people had to accomplish in a day what modern people accomplish with the help of machines, technology, and complex social systems. Food had to be prepared from basic ingredients, fires had to be maintained, animals had to be cared for, tools had to be maintained and repaired, and countless other tasks had to be completed using only human and animal power. The weather would have an immediate and direct impact on your day in ways that modern people rarely experience. If it was raining, many outdoor activities would become impossible. If it was cold, additional fuel would be needed for heating. If it was hot, working conditions would become dangerous. There was no climate control, no weather-resistant clothing, and no option to simply avoid outdoor activities because of poor weather conditions. Medieval people developed an intimate knowledge of weather patterns and seasonal changes that modern people have largely lost. They could predict weather changes by reading natural signs, they understood how different weather conditions affected different types of work, and they planned their activities around weather patterns in ways that required constant attention and flexibility. As the morning progressed and you attempted to begin the day's activities, you'd discover that medieval peasants had better work-life balance than you. This is another fact that would surprise most modern people. While medieval life was certainly harder in terms of physical demands and material comfort, the structure of medieval work was actually more humane in many ways than modern employment. Medieval workers typically worked from dawn to dusk, but this schedule varied dramatically with the seasons. In winter, when daylight hours were short, the working day was correspondingly short. Medieval people also observed numerous religious holidays throughout the year, far more than modern vacation time, and these were genuine days of rest when work was forbidden. The medieval work schedule was also more flexible and self-directed than most modern jobs. While the work itself was demanding, workers had more control over their pace, their methods, and their priorities. There was no time clock, no supervisor monitoring productivity, and no artificial deadlines imposed by bureaucratic systems. Medieval work was also more varied and engaging than most modern jobs. Instead of performing repetitive tasks in an office or factory, medieval workers engaged in diverse activities that required skill, creativity, and problem-solving. A medieval farmer was also a veterinarian, carpenter, weather forecaster, and numerous other roles that made work intellectually stimulating despite its physical demands. The real reason knights wore so much armor wasn't actually protection. This would be perhaps the most surprising revelation about medieval warfare and social structure. While armor certainly provided some defensive benefits, the primary purpose of elaborate armor was social signaling, displaying wealth, status, and identity in a society where visual symbols carried enormous importance. A full suit of plate armor cost more than a small farm and represented a massive investment that only the very wealthy could afford. The armor was custom-made by skilled craftsmen, fitted to the individual wearer, and decorated with personal heraldry and artistic elements that proclaimed the wearer's identity from a great distance. In many medieval battles, the social conventions around armor actually made combat less deadly rather than more so. Knights wearing expensive armor were valuable prisoners who could be ransomed for enormous sums, so there was strong incentive to capture rather than kill armored opponents. The armor thus served as a form of insurance policy rather than purely defensive equipment. The practical challenges of wearing medieval armor would be immediately apparent to anyone who tried it. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 50 and 70 pounds and distributed this weight awkwardly across the body. Moving in armor required specific training and conditioning that took years to develop. Even simple activities like mounting a horse, walking upstairs, or getting up from a fall became complex maneuvers that required practice and skill. The psychological effect of wearing armor would be equally challenging. The restricted vision through a helmet visor, the muffled hearing, and the claustrophobic feeling of being enclosed in metal would create anxiety and disorientation for someone not trained in its use. Medieval knights spent years developing the mental discipline necessary to fight effectively while dealing with these sensory limitations. But as someone experiencing medieval life as an ordinary person rather than a knight, you'd be much more concerned with the immediate challenges of finding and preparing food for breakfast. Medieval food procurement and preparation was a complex process that began long before the actual cooking and required knowledge and skills that modern people have forgotten. First, you'd need to determine what food was actually available. Medieval diets varied dramatically based on season, location, social status, and current economic conditions. Unlike modern grocery stores with their year-round availability of diverse foods, medieval food options were strictly limited by what could be produced locally and what could be preserved through current seasonal conditions. In winter, fresh foods were extremely limited. Most vegetables would be preserved through salting, drying, or fermentation. Fruits would be dried or preserved in honey. Meat would be salted, smoked, or preserved in fat. The process of preparing these preserved foods for eating required significant skill and often additional cooking time to make them palatable and safe. Even determining which preserved foods were still safe to eat would require expertise that modern people don't possess. Medieval people could identify spoilage by smell, texture, and appearance in ways that someone accustomed to expiration dates and modern food safety standards would find difficult. The consequences of eating spoiled food without modern medical care would be potentially deadly, making this knowledge crucial for survival. The actual cooking process would present immediate challenges that would test your patience and skill. Medieval cooking was done over open fires or in primitive ovens that required constant attention and careful management. There were no temperature controls, no timers, and no consistent heat sources. Every meal was a complex exercise in fire management, timing, and improvisation. Starting a cooking fire from the banked embers of the previous night's fire would require skill with kindling, understanding of airflow, and patience that modern people rarely develop. If the fire had gone out completely overnight, starting a new fire from scratch using flint and steel would be a time-consuming process that might take half an hour or more of concentrated effort. The cooking implements themselves would be unfamiliar and challenging to use. Heavy iron pots that had to be suspended over fires, long-handled spoons and ladles that were difficult to maneuver, and cooking surfaces that were uneven and unpredictable. Modern people accustomed to precise temperature control and non-stick surfaces would find medieval cooking frustratingly difficult. Medieval recipes, to the extent that they existed in written form, were vague by modern standards. Cooking times were described in terms like until done or while saying 3 prayers. Quantities were often omitted entirely with the assumption that experienced cooks would know the proper proportions. This approach to cooking required intuitive understanding and experience that could only be developed over years of practice. The ingredients themselves would taste different from modern versions. Medieval grains were heartier and more flavorful than modern processed varieties, but they were also more difficult to digest and required longer cooking times. Medieval vegetables were often more bitter and less sweet than modern cultivated varieties. Even familiar foods like bread, cheese, and meat would have flavors and textures that might be surprising or unpleasant to modern palates. Salt, which we take for granted as an inexpensive seasoning, was a precious commodity in medieval times. The effort required to preserve and transport salt made it expensive enough that many people used it sparingly. This meant that medieval food was often much less salty than modern food, but it also meant that salt was valued as a form of currency and social display. Medieval beverages would present their own challenges. As mentioned earlier, water was often unsafe, so many people relied on weak beer, ale, or wine as their primary daily drinks. These beverages were quite different from modern versions. Medieval beer was often thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol, serving as much as food as drink. Medieval wine was frequently mixed with water and spices, creating flavors that would be unfamiliar to modern wine drinkers. The social aspects of medieval meals would be as challenging as the practical ones. Medieval eating was often a communal activity with complex social protocols governing who ate what, when, and in what order. Meals were opportunities for reinforcing social hierarchies, conducting business, and maintaining community relationships in ways that would be foreign to modern individualistic eating habits. Medieval table manners were quite sophisticated, but they were based on different principles than modern etiquette. Sharing food from common dishes, eating with hands or simple utensils, and following complex rules about precedence and respect would require knowledge and social sensitivity that modern people would find difficult to master quickly. The time required for food preparation would be shocking to modern people accustomed to quick meals and convenient foods. Even a simple breakfast might require an hour or more of preparation time, including starting the fire, preparing ingredients, cooking, and cleaning up afterward. This time investment had to be multiplied by every meal of every day, making food preparation one of the most time-consuming activities of medieval life. The constant presence of hunger would be another aspect of medieval life that modern people would find difficult to endure. Even when food was available, medieval people rarely experienced the feeling of being completely full that modern people take for granted. Portions were smaller, calories were precious, and the constant physical demands of medieval life meant that people were almost always operating at some level of caloric deficit. Medieval people developed sophisticated strategies for managing hunger and making limited food supplies last as long as possible. They understood which foods provided the most nutrition and energy, how to combine foods for maximum benefit, and how to stretch ingredients through careful preparation and cooking techniques. But despite this knowledge, chronic mild hunger was a normal condition that shaped decision-making and behavior in ways that well-fed modern people would find difficult to understand. The seasonal nature of medieval food supply meant that hunger was not distributed evenly throughout the year. Late winter and early spring were typically the most difficult times, when preserved foods were running low and fresh foods were not yet available. Medieval communities developed elaborate strategies for surviving these lean periods, but they remained times of genuine hardship and increased mortality. The social implications of food scarcity created community dynamics that would be foreign to modern experience. Sharing food was both a moral obligation and a survival strategy. Communities developed complex systems of mutual aid and support that helped ensure that no one starved during difficult periods. But these systems also created social obligations and dependencies that modern people accustomed to individual self-sufficiency would find constraining. Food theft and hoarding were serious crimes in medieval communities, not just because of their immediate impact but because they threatened the social cooperation that everyone depended on for survival. The social pressure to share resources fairly was intense, and violations of these norms could result in social ostracism or even exile from the community. As the morning progressed and you struggled with the challenges of food preparation, you'd begin to understand that every aspect of medieval life was interconnected in ways that modern specialization has obscured. The person who grew the grain was often the same person who ground it into flour, baked it into bread, and served it at meals. This integration of roles created a deep understanding of the entire food system, but also meant that failure at any stage could have serious consequences. The weather that had seemed like a minor inconvenience when you first stepped outside would reveal its true importance as the day progressed. Medieval people lived with constant awareness of weather conditions because their impact was immediate and significant. A sudden rainstorm could ruin a day's worth of outdoor work. Unexpected cold could kill young animals or damage crops. Strong winds could damage buildings or make travel dangerous. Modern people, protected by climate control, weather-resistant clothing, and the ability to postpone outdoor activities, rarely experience the direct impact of weather on daily life. Medieval people had no such protection. They had to work outdoors regardless of conditions, and their comfort, productivity, and sometimes survival depended on their ability to adapt to whatever weather nature provided. The clothing that had seemed adequate when you got dressed in the relative warmth of your dwelling would reveal its limitations as you spent time outdoors. Medieval clothing was designed for durability and warmth rather than comfort or convenience. The heavy fabrics that provided insulation also restricted movement and became uncomfortable when wet. The multiple layers that were necessary for warmth made simple tasks more difficult and time-consuming. Medieval people developed sophisticated understanding of how to dress for different weather conditions and activities. They knew which fabrics worked best in different circumstances, how to layer clothing effectively, and how to modify their garments for maximum comfort and utility. But even with this knowledge, medieval clothing required constant attention and adjustment throughout the day. The maintenance of medieval clothing was a time-consuming process that modern people rarely consider. Garments had to be cleaned, repaired, and modified regularly to remain functional. Sewing, patching, and mending were essential skills that everyone needed to master. The investment in time and materials required to create clothing made every garment valuable and worth preserving as long as possible. Medieval laundry was a major undertaking that required planning, physical labor, and careful attention to detail. Clothes were washed in large batches using harsh soaps and hot water that had to be heated over fires. The washing process was physically demanding, involving scrubbing, wringing, and rinsing that would exhaust modern people unaccustomed to such labor. Drying clothes presented its own challenges, especially during cold or wet weather. Indoor drying was often necessary but created humidity and odor problems in small living spaces. Outdoor drying required protection from rain and wind that could damage wet fabrics. The entire laundry process, from start to finish, could take several days and required careful coordination with other household activities. As the morning wore on and you attempted to accomplish the basic tasks necessary for daily survival, you begin to understand that medieval life operated on completely different principles than modern life. Instead of specialization and efficiency, medieval life required versatility and resilience. Instead of individual autonomy, it required community cooperation. Instead of controlling the environment, it required adapting to natural conditions. The physical demands of medieval life would begin to take their toll on your modern body as the morning progressed. The constant bending, lifting, carrying, and walking required for basic tasks would strain muscles that were unaccustomed to such activity. Your hands would become sore from gripping unfamiliar tools and implements. Your feet would ache from walking on uneven surfaces without modern footwear. The mental demands would be equally challenging. The constant attention required to manage fires, monitor weather, assess food safety, and navigate social interactions would be exhausting for someone accustomed to the automated and simplified decision-making of modern life. Every choice would require careful consideration of multiple factors that modern people rarely think about. The lack of privacy and personal space would become increasingly stressful as the day progressed. Medieval communities were small and close-knit, meaning that your activities, conversations, and even personal habits would be visible to others. The modern expectation of personal privacy and individual space simply didn't exist in medieval society. The constant presence of dirt, dust, and organic matter would be immediately noticeable to someone accustomed to modern cleanliness standards. Medieval environments were dusty from unpaved roads, smoky from constant fires, and filled with the detritus of human and animal activity. The effort required to maintain even basic cleanliness in such an environment would be constant and demanding. Medieval people had different standards of cleanliness than modern people, but they were not indifferent to dirt and disorder. They swept floors regularly, cleaned cooking implements carefully, and maintained their personal appearance as well as their circumstances allowed. But the environmental conditions made complete cleanliness impossible, and medieval people accepted a level of dirt and disorder that would be stressful for modern people. The sounds of medieval life would continue to be overwhelming throughout the morning. The constant noise of human and animal activity, the sounds of manual labor and craftswork, and the organic acoustics of a world without sound insulation would create an audio environment that modern people would find distracting and exhausting. Medieval people developed the ability to filter and prioritize sounds in ways that modern people have lost. They could identify important sounds, danger signals, calls for help, or changes in weather while ignoring routine background noise. This auditory discrimination was a survival skill that required years of experience to develop. As the morning progressed toward midday, you begin to understand that you had accomplished very little despite hours of effort. The simple tasks that modern people complete in minutes, getting clean, eating breakfast, getting dressed, would have consumed most of your morning and left you physically and mentally exhausted. And this was just the beginning. The afternoon would bring new challenges and demands that would test your endurance and adaptability even further. The evening would require additional food preparation, maintenance activities, and social obligations that would extend your day long past modern bedtimes. The medieval day was structured around maximizing the use of daylight hours, which meant that summer days were extremely long and winter days were correspondingly short. There was no artificial lighting adequate for detailed work, so most productive activities had to be completed during daylight hours. This created a rhythm of life that was tied directly to natural cycles in ways that modern people rarely experience. The social obligations of medieval life would begin to assert themselves more strongly as the morning progressed and other community members became active. Medieval communities operated on complex networks of mutual obligation and reciprocal assistance that modern people would find difficult to understand and navigate. Everyone in a medieval community had specific roles and responsibilities that were defined by their social status, family relationships, and economic position. These roles came with both privileges and obligations that were enforced by social pressure and community expectations. Failing to fulfill your obligations could have serious consequences for your social standing and economic survival. The hierarchical nature of medieval society meant that every interaction was governed by complex rules of precedence and respect. How you spoke to different people, what deference you showed, and what obligations you acknowledged all depended on relative social status in ways that would be foreign to modern egalitarian sensibilities. As you struggled through your first medieval morning, you begin to realize that survival in this world required not just physical strength and endurance, but also social intelligence, community cooperation, and deep knowledge of countless practical skills that modern people have forgotten. The morning that had started with the simple challenge of getting out of bed would have revealed the enormous complexity and difficulty of medieval life. And this was just the beginning of a day that would continue to test your limits in ways you never imagined possible. The medieval day was structured around maximizing the use of daylight hours, which meant that summer days were extremely long and winter days were correspondingly short. There was no artificial lighting adequate for detailed work, so most productive activities had to be completed during daylight hours. This created a rhythm of life that was tied directly to natural cycles in ways that modern people rarely experience. By midday, if you had somehow managed to survive the morning's challenges, you would be facing an entirely new set of difficulties that would test different aspects of your endurance and adaptability. The medieval midday brought with it the peak social activity of the community, the most demanding physical work of the day, and the complex social negotiations that kept medieval communities functioning. The medieval marketplace would be reaching its full intensity by this time of day, and the sensory assault would be overwhelming for someone accustomed to modern shopping environments. Medieval markets were not the orderly, regulated spaces that modern people expect. They were chaotic gatherings of people, animals, goods, and activities that created an atmosphere of controlled pandemonium. The sounds alone would be almost unbearable to modern ears. Merchants calling out their wares in loud voices, customers bargaining and arguing over prices, animals making noise as they were bought and sold, and the general hubbub of hundreds of people conducting business in a relatively small space. There was no background music, no climate control, and no sound dampening to soften the acoustic chaos. The smells of the medieval marketplace would be equally overwhelming. Food vendors cooking over open fires, animals and their waste, unwashed human bodies pressed together in crowds, leather, metal, spices, and dozens of other organic scents would create an olfactory environment that modern people would find difficult to tolerate. Medieval people had much more tolerance for strong smells than modern people, partly because they were accustomed to them and partly because their sense of smell was more developed and discriminating. They could identify quality, freshness, and safety through smell in ways that modern people have forgotten. But for someone with modern sensibilities, the medieval marketplace would be almost suffocating. The visual chaos would be equally disorienting. Medieval markets had no organized layouts, no standardized signage, and no clear traffic patterns. Vendors set up wherever space was available, customers moved in unpredictable patterns, and the overall organization was organic and constantly changing. Modern people accustomed to orderly retail environments would find this chaos stressful and difficult to navigate. The process of buying food or other necessities would require negotiation skills that modern people rarely develop. Everything was subject to bargaining, and prices were not fixed or standardized. Success in the marketplace required the ability to assess quality, understand fair prices, and negotiate effectively with vendors who were experienced in these skills. Medieval currency was also more complex than modern money. Instead of standardized bills and coins, medieval communities often used a mixture of different currencies, barter systems, and credit arrangements. Understanding the relative value of different coins, the current exchange rates between different currencies, and the complex web of credit and debt relationships would require knowledge that a modern person would not possess. The quality assessment of medieval goods would require expertise that modern people have lost. Without standardized manufacturing, modern quality control, or consumer protection laws, buyers had to be able to identify good and bad merchandise through direct examination. This required detailed knowledge of materials, construction techniques, and signs of quality or defect that could only be developed through experience. Medieval merchants were skilled at presenting their goods in the best possible light and concealing defects from inexperienced buyers. The phrase caveat emptor, buyer beware, originated in medieval markets where consumers had little legal protection against fraud or misrepresentation. A modern person attempting to navigate this environment would be vulnerable to numerous forms of exploitation. The social dynamics of the medieval marketplace would be as challenging as the practical aspects. Medieval commerce was conducted within complex webs of social relationship that determined who could buy and sell what, to whom, and under what conditions. Social status, family connections, guild memberships, and community standing all affected commercial relationships in ways that would be foreign to modern commercial interactions. The medieval guild system would be particularly challenging for a modern person to understand and navigate. Guilds controlled most aspects of commercial and craft activity, determining who could practice various trades, what standards had to be met, and how business could be conducted. These organizations were simultaneously professional associations, social clubs, religious organizations, and political entities that wielded enormous power over their members' lives. Attempting to purchase goods or services without understanding the guild system would be like trying to navigate a modern bureaucracy without understanding the rules and procedures. Even simple transactions could become complicated by questions of jurisdiction, authority, and protocol that would be opaque to an outsider. The working conditions in medieval crafts and trades would be shocking to modern people accustomed to workplace safety regulations and labor protections. Medieval workshops were often cramped, poorly lit, and filled with hazardous materials and processes. Workers regularly handled dangerous chemicals, worked with sharp tools and heavy machinery, and operated in environments that would be considered unsafe by any modern standard. Medieval blacksmiths worked with fires hot enough to melt metal in shops filled with smoke and toxic fumes, handling heavy hammers and sharp tools with minimal protective equipment. Medieval tanners worked with animal hides using chemicals that were caustic and potentially poisonous. Medieval dyers used substances that could cause serious health problems with prolonged exposure. The physical demands of medieval work would be exhausting for modern people unaccustomed to such labor. Most medieval jobs required strength, endurance, and manual dexterity that took years to develop. The repetitive motions, heavy lifting, and constant physical activity would strain modern bodies that are adapted to sedentary lifestyles. Medieval apprenticeship systems meant that most people began learning their trades as children and spent years developing the physical conditioning and skills necessary for their work. A modern person attempting to perform medieval labor without this preparation would be at severe disadvantage and would likely be unable to maintain the pace and quality that medieval standards required. The time requirements of medieval work would also be challenging for modern people accustomed to fixed schedules and regular hours. Medieval workdays varied with the seasons, weather conditions, and the demands of specific tasks. Some days might require 14 or 15 hours of labor while others might be shorter. But there was no concept of overtime pay, weekend breaks, or vacation time as modern people understand these concepts. Medieval workers also had to be prepared to work in conditions that modern people would consider unacceptable. Rain, cold, heat, and other weather conditions rarely stopped work entirely. Medieval people developed clothing, techniques, and mental attitudes that allowed them to continue working in conditions that would send modern workers home. The technological limitations of medieval work would be frustrating for modern people accustomed to powered tools and precision equipment. Everything was done by hand using simple tools that required skill and experience to use effectively. Tasks that can be completed in minutes with modern equipment might take hours or days using medieval methods. Medieval measuring and precision were also quite different from modern standards. Measurements were often approximate based on human-scaled units like feet, hands, and arms that varied from person to person. Precision work was possible but required exceptional skill and patience. Modern people accustomed to exact measurements and standardized units would find medieval precision standards frustrating and inadequate. The pace of medieval work was also fundamentally different from modern work. Instead of the constant pressure to increase efficiency and productivity that characterizes modern employment, medieval work followed natural rhythms and seasonal patterns. During harvest time or other peak periods, the pace would be intense and demanding. During slack periods, the pace would be more relaxed and sustainable. This natural variation in work intensity was actually more humane than modern industrial schedules, but it required mental flexibility and adaptability that modern people often lack. The ability to work intensively when necessary and rest when possible was a survival skill that medieval people developed through necessity. Medieval people also had to be much more versatile than modern workers. Instead of specializing in narrow fields, medieval people typically had to master multiple skills and be prepared to switch between different types of work as conditions required. A medieval farmer might also be a carpenter, a veterinarian, a weather forecaster, and numerous other roles that modern people consider separate professions. This versatility was necessary because medieval communities were small and isolated, and everyone had to be prepared to contribute whatever skills were needed for community survival. Specialization was a luxury that only the largest communities could afford, and even then, specialists had to be prepared to perform other tasks when necessary. The social interactions required for medieval work would be particularly challenging for modern people accustomed to professional workplace relationships. Medieval work relationships were personal, long-term, and embedded in complex webs of family, community, and religious obligation. Co-workers were also neighbors, fellow parishioners, and often relatives whose relationships extended far beyond the workplace. Conflict resolution in medieval work environments relied on community mediation, religious authority, and traditional customs rather than human resources departments, labor unions, or legal systems. Workplace disputes could become community disputes that affected every aspect of social life. The pressure to maintain harmonious relationships was intense because there was no option to simply change jobs or move to a different community. Medieval workplace hierarchy was also much more rigid than modern employment relationships. Social status determined workplace authority in ways that had little to do with skill, experience, or performance. The son of a noble family would have authority over experienced craftsmen regardless of his competence. Women, regardless of their abilities, were excluded from many types of work entirely. These social restrictions would be particularly frustrating for modern people accustomed to merit-based advancement and equal opportunity employment. The idea that your birth circumstances would permanently determine your career options and workplace status would be psychologically difficult for someone raised with modern expectations of social mobility. Medieval record-keeping and communication systems would also present significant challenges for anyone accustomed to modern information management. Business transactions were often conducted orally, with written records being rare and expensive. Memory was much more important than documentation, and people developed remarkable abilities to remember complex information without written aids. The lack of written contracts and formal agreements meant that business relationships relied heavily on reputation, trust, and community enforcement of social norms. A person's word was literally their bond, and breaking agreements or failing to fulfill obligations would result in social ostracism that could destroy one's ability to conduct business. Medieval communication over distances was slow and unreliable. Messages had to be carried by human messengers who traveled on foot or horseback over dangerous roads. Important information might take days or weeks to travel distances that modern people cross in hours. Business planning had to account for these communication delays in ways that modern people rarely consider. The seasonal nature of medieval commerce meant that many business activities could only be conducted at certain times of year. Agricultural products were available only during harvest seasons. Travel was difficult or impossible during winter months. Many crafts could only be practiced when weather conditions were suitable. This seasonal variation required long-term planning and resource management that modern people accustomed to year-round availability of goods and services would find challenging. Medieval merchants had to anticipate demand months in advance and store goods for long periods without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques. Medieval insurance and risk management were also quite different from modern systems. Instead of formal insurance policies, medieval people relied on family networks, community mutual aid, and religious organizations to provide assistance during difficult times. These systems provided some protection against disaster, but they also created complex social obligations that modern people would find constraining. The legal system that governed medieval commerce was also quite different from modern commercial law. Instead of standardized regulations and formal courts, medieval commerce was governed by local customs, guild regulations, and traditional practices that varied from place to place. Understanding and navigating this patchwork of legal authority would require local knowledge that a modern person would not possess. Medieval justice was also more personal and immediate than modern legal systems. Disputes were often resolved through direct negotiation, community mediation, or traditional forms of compensation rather than formal legal proceedings. This system could be more efficient than modern courts, but it also meant that justice was heavily influenced by personal relationships and social status. As the medieval day progressed toward evening, the accumulated stress and exhaustion of adapting to this foreign environment would begin to take a serious toll on anyone accustomed to modern life. The physical demands, social complexity, and constant vigilance required for medieval survival would be overwhelming for someone without years of preparation and conditioning. The evening routine would present its own set of challenges that would continue to test your endurance and adaptability. Preparing for night in a medieval environment required careful planning and preparation that modern people rarely consider. Security, warmth, and basic comfort all had to be actively maintained through human effort and vigilance. The evening routine would present its own set of challenges that would continue to test your endurance and adaptability. Preparing for night in a medieval environment required careful planning and preparation that modern people rarely consider. Security, warmth, and basic comfort all had to be actively maintained through human effort and vigilance. As the sun began to set, the temperature would drop noticeably and the immediate priority would become maintaining warmth through the coming night. This wasn't simply a matter of adjusting a thermostat or adding an extra blanket. Medieval heating required active fire management that was both labor-intensive and potentially dangerous. The evening fire had to be built carefully to provide maximum heat output while conserving precious fuel. Wood was not unlimited, especially during winter months when dead branches were scarce and cutting living trees required enormous effort with hand tools. Every piece of fuel had to be used efficiently and the fire had to be managed to burn steadily through the night without going out completely. Building and banking a fire for overnight burning required skills that modern people rarely develop. The arrangement of logs, the management of airflow, and the timing of fuel additions all required experience and attention that could mean the difference between a warm night and a potentially deadly cold one. Medieval people understood that a poorly managed fire could go out in the middle of the night, leaving everyone vulnerable to dangerous cold. The fire also represented a constant safety hazard that required vigilance and respect. Medieval buildings were constructed largely of wood, thatch, and other flammable materials. A single spark or carelessly managed flame could destroy an entire home and potentially spread to neighboring buildings. Fire safety in medieval communities was a community responsibility that everyone took seriously. Medieval people developed elaborate safety protocols around fire management that would seem excessive to modern people protected by fire departments, sprinkler systems, and fire-resistant building materials. But in a world where fire was both essential for survival and potentially deadly, these precautions were literally matters of life and death. The evening meal preparation would be another major undertaking that would consume significant time and energy. Unlike modern dinners that can be prepared quickly from processed ingredients, medieval evening meals required hours of preparation time and careful coordination of multiple cooking processes. The main meal of the medieval day was typically eaten in the late afternoon or early evening when the day's work was complete but sufficient daylight remained for food preparation and cleanup. This meal was often the most substantial and complex of the day, requiring multiple dishes that had to be coordinated to finish cooking at approximately the same time. Medieval cooking required constant attention and adjustment. Fires burned unevenly, pots boiled over, and food could burn or undercook easily without modern temperature controls. The cook had to monitor multiple dishes simultaneously while managing the fire, adjusting cooking times based on weather conditions, and ensuring that food was safe to eat without modern food safety equipment. The social aspects of medieval evening meals were as important as the nutritional aspects. Evening meals were often communal events that brought together family members, servants, and sometimes neighbors or guests. These gatherings served multiple functions beyond simple nutrition. They were opportunities for sharing information, conducting business, resolving disputes, and maintaining social relationships. Medieval table etiquette was quite sophisticated but based on principles that would be foreign to modern diners. The sharing of food from common dishes, the use of bread as plates, and the complex rules governing who was served first and in what order all reflected social hierarchies and cultural values that modern people would find difficult to understand and navigate. The cleanup after medieval meals was also much more labor-intensive than modern dishwashing. Plates and utensils had to be washed by hand in water that was heated over fires. Grease and food residue had to be removed using harsh soaps made from lye and animal fats. The entire cleanup process could take an hour or more after each meal. Medieval people also had to deal with food waste in ways that modern people rarely consider. Spoiled food couldn't simply be thrown away, it had to be composted, fed to animals, or disposed of in ways that wouldn't attract pests or create sanitation problems. Every scrap of food had value, and waste was carefully minimized through planning and careful storage. As evening progressed into night, the social dynamics of medieval communities would become more apparent. Medieval evenings were times for social interaction, entertainment, and community building that were essential for maintaining the social cohesion that everyone depended on for survival. Medieval entertainment was quite different from modern passive consumption of media. Instead of television, movies, or recorded music, medieval people created their own entertainment through storytelling, music, games, and conversation. These activities required active participation and social skills that modern people often lack. Medieval storytelling was a highly developed art form that served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. Stories preserved historical information, transmitted cultural values, provided moral instruction, and created shared experiences that bound communities together. Skilled storytellers were valued members of medieval communities who could hold audiences spellbound for hours with their performances. Medieval music was also participatory rather than passive. Instead of listening to recorded performances, medieval people sang, played instruments, and danced together. Musical skills were common accomplishments that most people developed to some degree. Community singing and dancing were regular parts of medieval social life that created bonds and shared experiences. Medieval games and sports were often quite different from modern versions. Many medieval games were designed to develop skills that had practical applications. Archery contests improved hunting and military abilities, wrestling matches developed physical strength and fighting skills, and strategy games sharpened mental abilities that were useful in daily life. The social hierarchies that governed medieval daily life were often relaxed somewhat during evening entertainment, but they never disappeared entirely. Even during celebrations and festivals, everyone remained aware of their social status and the appropriate behavior for their position. Modern people accustomed to more egalitarian social interactions would find these persistent hierarchies constraining and uncomfortable. Medieval religious observances also played a major role in evening activities. Evening prayers, religious readings, and spiritual discussions were regular parts of medieval daily life that modern secular people would find foreign and potentially uncomfortable. Religion wasn't separated from other aspects of life, it was integrated into work, social interaction, and personal reflection in ways that shaped every aspect of medieval experience. As night fell completely, the challenges of medieval life would intensify in ways that modern people protected by artificial lighting and modern security systems would find difficult to imagine. Medieval nights were dark in ways that modern people rarely experience, and this darkness brought with it both practical challenges and psychological stresses. Medieval lighting was expensive, dangerous, and inadequate by modern standards. Candles were made from animal fat or beeswax and provided only dim, flickering light that was insufficient for detailed work or safe movement. Oil lamps provided slightly better illumination but required costly fuel and careful maintenance to prevent fires or toxic fumes. Most medieval people went to bed shortly after sunset simply because the cost and danger of artificial lighting made evening activities impractical. This meant that winter nights, which could last 14 or 15 hours in northern climates, were spent largely in bed or in darkened rooms with minimal activity. The psychological impact of long, dark nights would be challenging for modern people accustomed to artificial lighting and evening entertainment. The combination of boredom, isolation, and darkness would create conditions that could lead to depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges that medieval people had to manage without modern medical understanding or treatment. Medieval people developed various strategies for coping with long winter nights, including increased social interaction, indoor crafts that could be done by firelight, and spiritual practices that provided comfort and meaning during difficult periods. But these coping mechanisms required community support and cultural knowledge that modern people would not possess. The security concerns that came with medieval nights would be another source of stress and vigilance that modern people rarely experience. Medieval communities faced real threats from bandits, wild animals, and social unrest that made nighttime security a serious concern. Medieval doors and windows were secured with heavy bars, multiple locks, and other defensive measures that reflected the genuine dangers that people faced. Weapons were kept readily available, and everyone had to be prepared to defend their homes and families against potential threats. The sounds of medieval nights would be quite different from modern nights. Instead of the distant hum of traffic and machinery, medieval nights would be filled with the sounds of animals, weather, and human activity. Dogs barking, owls calling, wind in the trees, and the occasional sound of people moving around would create an acoustic environment that modern people would find either soothing or unsettling depending on their familiarity with natural sounds. Medieval people developed remarkable abilities to interpret nighttime sounds and identify potential threats or normal activities. They could distinguish between the sound of their own animals and strange animals, between normal wind and storms, and between routine human activity and potential danger. These skills were essential for survival but required years of experience to develop. Sleep patterns in medieval times were also quite different from modern sleep habits. Medieval people typically slept in two distinct periods separated by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. This first sleep and second sleep pattern was the normal human sleep cycle before artificial lighting changed our relationship with darkness. During the period of nighttime wakefulness, medieval people would engage in quiet activities like prayer, meditation, conversation, or intimate relations. This period was considered a natural and important part of the daily cycle, not a sleep disorder that needed to be corrected. The sleeping arrangements themselves would be challenging for modern people accustomed to private bedrooms and individual beds. Medieval families often shared beds not just for warmth but also because beds were expensive pieces of furniture that represented significant investments. Privacy during sleep was rare except among the very wealthy. Medieval beds were also quite different from modern mattresses. The straw-filled ticks that served as mattresses were comfortable when fresh but became lumpy and uncomfortable over time. Bedding had to be changed and refreshed regularly to maintain comfort and hygiene. The process of preparing for sleep in medieval times required more effort and planning than modern bedtime routines. Securing the house, banking the fire, and arranging bedding all had to be done carefully to ensure safety and comfort through the night. Medieval people also had to prepare for the possibility that they might need to wake up quickly and respond to emergencies during the night. Fires, intruders, sick family members, or other crises could require immediate action at any time. This meant that medieval people slept more lightly than modern people and were always partially alert to their surroundings. The clothing worn to bed was also quite different from modern sleepwear. Medieval people often slept in their undergarments or even fully clothed both for warmth and for security. The idea of special sleeping clothes was a luxury that most people couldn't afford. This meant that comfort during sleep was compromised by clothing that wasn't designed for sleeping. Medieval children's bedtime routines would be particularly challenging for modern parents to manage. Children shared beds with siblings, parents, or other family members, making bedtime a complex negotiation of space, comfort, and behavior. The lack of individual rooms or private spaces meant that children had to learn to sleep despite noise, movement, and other disturbances that would keep modern children awake. Medieval parents also had to worry about child safety during sleep in ways that modern parents rarely consider. The risk of suffocation in shared beds, the danger of falling out of high beds, and the threat of fire or other emergencies required constant vigilance that would be exhausting for modern parents accustomed to safer sleeping environments. The seasonal variations in medieval sleep schedules would also be challenging for modern people accustomed to consistent daily routines. Winter nights required longer sleep periods simply because there was little that could be accomplished safely in the dark. Summer nights were shorter, but the demands of agricultural work meant that people often had to wake very early to take advantage of daylight hours. Medieval people also had to adjust their sleep schedules based on weather conditions, social obligations, and economic necessities in ways that modern people rarely experience. A sick animal might require nighttime care, a neighbor in crisis might need assistance, or emergency work might be necessary to prevent disaster. The physical discomfort of medieval sleep would be immediate and persistent for anyone accustomed to modern comfort standards. The lumpy mattresses, rough bedding, and lack of temperature control would make restful sleep difficult even for someone exhausted by the day's activities. Medieval people also had to deal with pest problems during sleep that modern people rarely encounter. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were common problems that required constant vigilance and management. The itching and irritation caused by these pests would make sleep uncomfortable and frequently interrupted. The air quality in medieval sleeping areas would also be challenging for modern people accustomed to clean, filtered air. The combination of smoke from fires, body odor from multiple people sharing small spaces, and the organic smells of straw mattresses and wool bedding would create an atmosphere that modern people would find difficult to tolerate. Medieval people developed tolerance for these conditions through lifetime exposure, but they also used various strategies to improve air quality and comfort. Aromatic herbs, frequent airing of bedding, and careful attention to cleanliness all helped to make sleeping conditions more pleasant within the constraints of medieval technology. The psychological stress of medieval sleep would be another challenge that modern people would find difficult to manage. The constant awareness of potential dangers, the discomfort of the sleeping environment, and the lack of privacy would create anxiety that could make sleep elusive even when physical exhaustion was extreme. Medieval people developed mental disciplines and spiritual practices that helped them find peace and rest despite these challenging conditions. Prayer, meditation, and acceptance of discomfort as normal parts of life all contributed to their ability to sleep despite conditions that would seem intolerable to modern people. The sounds that accompanied medieval sleep would be quite different from the white noise and ambient sounds that modern people are accustomed to. The crackling of fires, the breathing and movement of other people in the room, and the various sounds of night-active animals would create an acoustic environment that could be either comforting or disturbing depending on one's familiarity with it. Medieval people learned to interpret these sounds and identify which ones indicated normal conditions and which ones might signal danger or problems. This constant low-level monitoring required mental energy that modern people don't typically expend during sleep. The duration and quality of medieval sleep were also affected by factors that modern people rarely consider. Hunger, cold, physical pain from the day's labor, and worry about tomorrow's challenges all contributed to sleep difficulties that had to be managed without modern medical interventions or sleep aids. Medieval people understood that good sleep was essential for health and productivity, but they had limited tools for ensuring restful sleep. Herbal remedies, comfortable positioning, and mental preparation were the primary methods available for improving sleep quality. The morning routine that would follow this challenging night would bring its own set of difficulties, creating a cycle of physical and mental stress that would be cumulative over time. Each day would add to the accumulated fatigue and strain of adapting to medieval life conditions. Modern people attempting to live medieval lives would likely experience progressive deterioration in their physical and mental condition as the unfamiliar stresses and demands took their toll. The human body and mind are remarkably adaptable, but the adjustment period for such dramatic lifestyle changes would be lengthy and difficult. Medieval people developed their resilience and adaptation to these conditions over lifetimes of gradual exposure and conditioning. They learned coping strategies, built physical strength and endurance, and developed mental attitudes that allowed them to thrive despite conditions that would challenge modern people. The community support systems that helped medieval people manage these challenges would also be essential for survival, but they would require social skills and cultural knowledge that modern people would need time to develop. The interdependence that characterized medieval communities was both a source of support and a source of additional stress and obligation. The seasonal cycles that governed medieval life would create periods of particular difficulty that would test even the most adaptable modern person. Winter months, with their combination of cold, darkness, food scarcity, and isolation, would be especially challenging for someone without lifetime preparation for these conditions. Medieval people understood that survival required careful preparation, community cooperation, and mental resilience that had to be maintained consistently over long periods. The margin for error was small, and mistakes could have serious consequences for individual and community survival. The accumulation of small stresses and discomforts that characterized medieval daily life would be particularly challenging for modern people accustomed to quick solutions and immediate relief for minor problems. Medieval people learned to accept and manage discomfort as a normal part of life, while modern people often expect problems to be solved quickly and efficiently. The pace of adaptation to medieval life would be crucial for survival, but it would also be limited by human physiology and psychology. Some adjustments could be made quickly, while others would require months or years of gradual conditioning. Modern people attempting to live medieval lives would need to be realistic about these limitations and plan accordingly. The skills and knowledge required for medieval survival were extensive and interconnected in ways that would make partial adaptation difficult. Success in one area often depended on competence in multiple other areas, creating a complex web of requirements that would be challenging to master simultaneously. Medieval people also had the advantage of cultural transmission of knowledge through families and communities that passed down essential skills and information through generations. Modern people would lack this cultural foundation and would need to acquire medieval knowledge through deliberate study and practice rather than natural cultural transmission. The mental attitude required for medieval life would be perhaps the most challenging aspect for modern people to develop. Medieval people accepted uncertainty, discomfort, and hardship as normal parts of life while maintaining hope and resilience in the face of constant challenges. This mental framework was essential for psychological survival but would be difficult for modern people to adopt. The religious and spiritual dimensions of medieval life provided important sources of meaning, comfort, and community support that helped people endure difficult conditions. Modern secular people would need to find alternative sources of psychological support and meaning to replace these traditional resources. The long-term health effects of medieval life would also be significant considerations for modern people attempting this lifestyle. The physical demands, nutritional limitations, environmental stresses, and medical risks would all contribute to health challenges that could be serious or even life-threatening without modern medical support. Medieval people had shorter lifespans than modern people partly because of these health challenges, but they also developed remarkable resilience and adaptation that allowed many to live full and meaningful lives despite difficult conditions. The trade-offs between modern comfort and medieval challenges would be complex and personal decisions that each individual would need to evaluate carefully. As this long medieval day finally draws to its close, you would be lying in your straw-filled bed, surrounded by the sounds and smells of medieval night, facing another period of uncomfortable and interrupted sleep before waking to repeat the entire cycle again. The realization that this was not a temporary experience but a permanent way of life would be perhaps the most daunting aspect of all. Medieval people found joy, meaning, and satisfaction in their lives despite these challenges, but they also lived with levels of physical discomfort, uncertainty, and hardship that modern people would find difficult to accept. The question of whether you could not just survive but actually thrive in medieval conditions would depend on your ability to develop new skills, new attitudes, and new sources of resilience that most modern people have never needed to cultivate. The question of whether you could not just survive but actually thrive in medieval conditions would depend on your ability to develop new skills, new attitudes, and new sources of resilience that most modern people have never needed to cultivate. But there's another layer to this medieval experience that we haven't fully explored yet: the deeper psychological and social adaptations that would be required for long-term survival in this radically different world. The concept of time itself would fundamentally challenge your modern mindset in ways that might not be immediately apparent but would gradually wear down your psychological defenses. Medieval people lived in what historians call task time rather than clock time. Work was organized around completing necessary tasks rather than fixed schedules, and the rhythm of life followed natural cycles rather than artificial time divisions. This might sound relaxing to modern people stressed by rigid schedules and time pressure, but in practice, it would create a different kind of stress that would be equally challenging. Without clear time boundaries, work could expand to fill available time, and the pressure to accomplish essential tasks for survival would be constant and unrelenting. Medieval people didn't have weekends in the modern sense. While religious holidays provided breaks from work, the animals still needed to be fed, fires still needed to be maintained, and emergencies still needed to be addressed. The modern concept of personal time that belongs entirely to the individual simply didn't exist in a world where survival depended on constant vigilance and effort. The seasonal variations in medieval work would also create psychological challenges that modern people would find difficult to manage. During harvest season, the pace would be frantic and exhausting, with 18-hour days of backbreaking labor that couldn't be postponed or delayed. During winter, the pace would slow dramatically, but the stress of making limited resources last through the cold months would create a different kind of pressure. Modern people are accustomed to relatively consistent work demands throughout the year, with variations managed through technology, supply chains, and economic systems that buffer individual workers from seasonal extremes. Medieval people had to personally absorb these variations through their own physical and mental effort. The uncertainty that characterized medieval life would be another constant source of stress that modern people would find difficult to tolerate. Weather could destroy crops, illness could devastate families, political conflicts could disrupt communities, and natural disasters could eliminate years of careful preparation in a matter of hours or days. Modern people live with various forms of insurance, social safety nets, and institutional protections that provide at least some security against major disasters. Medieval people had to accept that their lives could be fundamentally changed or ended at any time by forces completely beyond their control. This uncertainty required a psychological framework that combined careful preparation with acceptance of limited control over outcomes. Medieval people had to work as if their efforts would certainly succeed while simultaneously accepting that failure was always possible despite their best efforts. The development of this psychological resilience would be a gradual process that would test modern people's mental health in ways that could be genuinely dangerous. The transition period from modern security to medieval uncertainty would be particularly challenging and could trigger serious psychological responses including depression, anxiety, and despair. Medieval people also had different concepts of individual identity and personal fulfillment that would be foreign to modern sensibilities. The modern emphasis on self-actualization, personal choice, and individual achievement would be not just irrelevant but potentially counterproductive in a world where survival depended on community cooperation and acceptance of traditional roles. Medieval identity was primarily defined by family, community, and social position rather than personal achievement or individual characteristics. A person was known as someone's son or daughter, a member of a particular village, a practitioner of a specific trade, or a servant of a particular lord. Personal qualities and achievements were important but secondary to these social identifications. This externally defined identity provided stability and security that modern people often lack. But it also constrained individual expression and choice in ways that would be frustrating for people raised with modern expectations of personal autonomy. The trade-off between security and freedom would be a constant tension that medieval people had to navigate. The religious dimensions of medieval life would present particular challenges for modern people who live in predominantly secular societies. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a personal belief system, it was the organizing principle for community life, social relationships, political authority, and individual behavior. Medieval people attended religious services multiple times per week, observed numerous religious holidays throughout the year, and integrated prayer and religious reflection into their daily routines. Religious authority figures had significant power over personal decisions including marriage, business practices, and social relationships. For modern people accustomed to separation of church and state and personal religious choice, this level of religious involvement in daily life would be constraining and potentially oppressive. But for medieval people, religious faith provided meaning, comfort, and community support that were essential for psychological survival. The medieval understanding of suffering and hardship was also quite different from modern attitudes. Medieval Christian theology taught that suffering was both inevitable and potentially redemptive, that enduring hardship with patience and faith could lead to spiritual growth and eternal reward. This theological framework helped medieval people find meaning in difficult experiences and maintain hope despite harsh conditions. Modern people, who are more likely to view suffering as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be endured, would find this attitude difficult to adopt but might find it necessary for psychological survival. The community support systems that characterized medieval life would provide some compensation for the individual hardships, but they would also create social obligations and constraints that modern people would find burdensome. Medieval communities operated on principles of mutual aid and reciprocal obligation that ensured everyone received help when needed but also required everyone to provide help when asked. These obligations weren't optional or voluntary, they were social requirements that were enforced through community pressure, religious authority, and economic necessity. Failing to fulfill community obligations could result in social ostracism that would make survival difficult or impossible. Modern people accustomed to individual choice about social involvement and charitable giving would find these mandatory community obligations constraining. But they would also discover that the security and support provided by these systems could be life-saving during difficult periods. The medieval approach to conflict resolution would also challenge modern assumptions about justice, fairness, and individual rights. Medieval communities typically resolved disputes through mediation, compensation, and community pressure rather than formal legal proceedings. This system could be more flexible and personal than modern legal systems, but it was also heavily influenced by social status, family connections, and community politics in ways that modern people would consider unfair or corrupt. The concept of equal justice under law simply didn't exist in medieval society. Medieval people understood that their status and treatment would depend partly on their family background, social connections, and community standing rather than solely on their individual actions or legal rights. This reality required different strategies for navigating conflicts and protecting personal interests. The economic insecurity that characterized medieval life would be another constant source of stress that modern people would find difficult to manage. Most medieval people lived close to subsistence levels, with little surplus to protect them against bad harvests, illness, or other economic disasters. The modern concept of disposable income, money that can be spent on non-essential items for pleasure or convenience, simply didn't exist for most medieval people. Every economic decision was a calculation about survival and security rather than comfort or enjoyment. This economic pressure would force modern people to re-evaluate their relationship with material possessions and consumption in fundamental ways. The abundance that modern people take for granted would be replaced by scarcity that would require careful resource management and constant attention to priorities. Medieval people developed sophisticated strategies for managing scarce resources, including complex systems of sharing, trading, and mutual support that maximized community survival. But these systems required social skills and cultural knowledge that modern people would need time to develop. The physical environment of medieval life would also create health challenges that would be cumulative and increasingly serious over time. The combination of poor nutrition, physical stress, environmental toxins, and infectious diseases would gradually wear down even the strongest modern person. Medieval people had shorter lifespans than modern people partly because of these environmental challenges, but they also developed remarkable resilience and adaptation that allowed many to live productive lives despite difficult conditions. The key was gradual adaptation and community support rather than individual endurance. Modern people attempting to live medieval lives would need to be realistic about the health risks and plan for medical support that could bridge the gap between medieval and modern healthcare. The romantic notion of living simply and naturally would need to be balanced against the real dangers of pre-modern medical conditions. The seasonal affective challenges of medieval life would be particularly difficult for modern people unaccustomed to long periods of darkness, cold, and indoor confinement. Medieval winters could last 5 or 6 months in northern climates, with extremely limited daylight and outdoor activity. Medieval people developed cultural practices and mental disciplines that helped them cope with these challenging periods, including increased social interaction, indoor crafts and entertainment, and spiritual practices that provided meaning and hope during dark times. Modern people, who are accustomed to artificial lighting, heated indoor environments, and year-round entertainment options would find the psychological challenges of medieval winters particularly difficult to endure without modern support systems. The educational and intellectual limitations of medieval life would also be challenging for modern people accustomed to access to information, entertainment, and intellectual stimulation. Medieval literacy rates were extremely low, books were rare and expensive, and intellectual pursuits were luxury activities that most people couldn't afford. Medieval people who were intellectually curious had to rely on oral tradition, limited written materials, and direct observation and experience for learning. The vast world of information that modern people accessed through books, internet, and media simply wasn't available to medieval people. This intellectual isolation would be particularly challenging for modern people who are accustomed to constant access to news, entertainment, and educational materials. The boredom and intellectual frustration of medieval life could be serious challenges to mental health and psychological well-being. Medieval people compensated for these limitations through rich oral traditions, skilled storytelling, and community-based entertainment that engaged imagination and creativity in ways that modern people often don't experience. But developing appreciation for these alternative forms of intellectual stimulation would require significant cultural adaptation. The gender roles and social expectations of medieval life would also create challenges for modern people, particularly women, who are accustomed to more egalitarian social structures. Medieval society was explicitly hierarchical and patriarchal in ways that would be constraining and frustrating for people raised with modern expectations of gender equality. Medieval women had fewer legal rights, economic opportunities, and social freedoms than modern women, but they also had important roles and responsibilities within their families and communities that provided meaning and social status. The trade-offs between security and autonomy would be complex and personal decisions. Medieval men also faced social expectations and obligations that would be foreign to modern sensibilities. The emphasis on honor, loyalty, and social obligation created pressures that could be as constraining as they were supportive. The technological limitations of medieval life would create daily frustrations that would accumulate over time and test the patience of modern people accustomed to efficient tools and convenient solutions. Every task would take longer, require more physical effort, and produce less satisfactory results than modern people expect. Simple activities like communication, transportation, food preparation, and household maintenance would require skills, time, and effort that modern people are not prepared to invest. The learning curve for medieval technology would be steep and frustrating for people accustomed to intuitive, user-friendly modern tools. Medieval people developed remarkable skills and ingenuity within the constraints of their technology, but they also accepted limitations and inefficiencies that modern people would find intolerable. The psychological adjustment to slower, more difficult, and less reliable technology would be a significant challenge. The social isolation that would result from these various adaptations could be one of the most serious challenges for modern people attempting to live medieval lives. The combination of physical stress, social constraints, technological limitations, and cultural differences would create a sense of alienation that could be psychologically dangerous. Medieval people were sustained by community connections, religious faith, and cultural traditions that provided meaning and support during difficult times. Modern people would need to find alternative sources of psychological support and social connection to replace these traditional resources. The gradual realization that medieval life wasn't a temporary experience or interesting experiment but a permanent way of life would be perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of the entire adaptation process. The cumulative effect of daily hardships, social constraints, and physical challenges would test mental resilience in ways that could have serious long-term consequences. But medieval people did find joy, satisfaction, and meaning in their lives despite these challenges. They developed sources of happiness and fulfillment that were adapted to their circumstances and created rich, meaningful lives within the constraints of their world. The question isn't whether medieval life was better or worse than modern life, but whether modern people could develop the skills, attitudes, and resilience necessary to thrive under radically different conditions. The answer would depend on individual adaptability, community support, and the gradual development of new ways of finding meaning and satisfaction in a very different world. The question isn't whether medieval life was better or worse than modern life, but whether modern people could develop the skills, attitudes, and resilience necessary to thrive under radically different conditions. The answer would depend on individual adaptability, community support, and the gradual development of new ways of finding meaning and satisfaction in a very different world. Perhaps one of the most profound realizations that would come to a modern person living through this medieval day would be understanding just how much of our current existence depends on systems and infrastructures that we barely notice. The electricity that powers our lights, the complex supply chains that stock our grocery stores, the water treatment plants that provide clean drinking water, the transportation networks that connect us to the wider world. All of these would be absent from medieval life, replaced by human effort, local resources, and community cooperation. The psychological impact of this realization would be significant. Modern people often feel anxious about technology dependence, but actually experiencing life without these systems would reveal just how fundamental they are to our survival and comfort. The independence that modern people often take for granted would be revealed as interdependence on complex systems that most people don't understand and couldn't replicate. Medieval people were also dependent on systems and infrastructure, but these were human-scale systems that individuals could understand, participate in, and influence directly. The village blacksmith, the local mill, the community well, the parish church, these were institutions that people could see, touch, and comprehend in ways that modern infrastructure often isn't. This difference in scale and comprehensibility would create different relationships between individuals and their supporting systems. Medieval people might have had less powerful infrastructure, but they had more direct control and understanding of the systems they depended on for survival. The learning curve for medieval skills would be one of the most challenging aspects of adaptation for modern people. Unlike modern skills that often can be learned through books, videos, or formal education, medieval skills typically required apprenticeship, hands-on experience, and years of practice to master. A medieval carpenter didn't just need to know how to use tools, they needed to understand wood types, seasoning processes, joinery techniques, and dozens of other specialized knowledge areas that could only be acquired through direct experience and mentorship. Modern people accustomed to quick learning through multiple information sources would find the slow, experiential learning process frustrating. The master-apprentice relationship that characterized medieval skill transmission would also be foreign to modern educational experiences. Medieval apprentices lived with their masters, worked without pay for years, and submitted to authority relationships that modern people would find oppressive. But this system also provided intensive, personalized education that modern institutions often can't match. Medieval craftsmanship reached levels of skill and artistry that modern industrial production rarely achieves, but this excellence came at the cost of time, effort, and human resources that modern economies can't afford. The trade-off between efficiency and quality would be apparent in every aspect of medieval life. The pace of technological change in medieval society would also be dramatically different from modern experience. While medieval people did develop new techniques and innovations, the rate of change was much slower than modern people expect. Tools, techniques, and social practices might remain essentially unchanged for generations or even centuries. This technological stability had both advantages and disadvantages. Medieval people could invest time in mastering skills without worrying that their knowledge would become obsolete quickly. But they also had fewer opportunities to improve their conditions through technological innovation. Modern people accustomed to rapid technological change and constant innovation would find the technological stagnation of medieval life limiting and frustrating. The expectation that problems should have technological solutions would be repeatedly disappointed in a world where human adaptation was often the only option. The environmental awareness that medieval life would force upon modern people would be both enlightening and challenging. Medieval people lived in direct contact with natural cycles and environmental conditions in ways that created intimate knowledge of ecological systems but also vulnerability to environmental changes. Medieval farmers understood soil conditions, weather patterns, plant and animal behavior, and seasonal cycles with sophistication that modern people rarely develop. This knowledge was essential for survival and was passed down through generations of careful observation and experience. But medieval people also lived with environmental risks that modern people are protected from through technology and infrastructure. Crop failures, severe weather, and natural disasters could have immediate and devastating impacts on individual families and entire communities. The environmental sustainability of medieval life was partly a result of technological limitations rather than conscious conservation choices. Medieval people used renewable resources and created relatively little waste partly because they didn't have alternatives rather than because they were environmentally conscious in the modern sense. The relationship between humans and animals in medieval society would be another area where modern people would need significant psychological adjustment. Medieval people lived in much closer contact with animals than most modern people, but this contact was primarily utilitarian rather than sentimental. Farm animals were valuable economic resources that provided food, labor, materials, and transportation. They were cared for carefully because they were essential for survival, but they were also killed, eaten, and used in ways that modern people might find disturbing. Medieval people developed emotional attachments to animals, but these relationships were balanced by practical necessities in ways that modern pet ownership rarely requires. The decision to slaughter an animal for food might be emotionally difficult, but it would also be economically necessary for family survival. The hunting and fishing that supplemented medieval diets would also require modern people to confront their relationships with killing animals for food in direct, personal ways. Medieval people understood that meat came from animals that had to be killed, and many people participated directly in this process. Modern people who are removed from food production by industrial agriculture and retail systems would find the direct killing and processing of animals psychologically challenging, even if they regularly eat meat that others have processed for them. The waste management challenges of medieval life would be another area where modern people would need to develop new skills and attitudes. Medieval communities produced much less waste than modern societies, but they also had fewer options for disposal and processing of the waste they did create. Human waste disposal was a constant challenge that required careful management to prevent disease and contamination. Medieval people developed various systems for managing sewage and garbage, but these systems required community cooperation and individual responsibility that modern people might find burdensome. The concept of throwing things away barely existed in medieval society. Items that were broken were repaired, items that were worn out were repurposed, and even garbage was often composted or fed to animals. The throwaway culture that characterizes modern consumption would be impossible in a world where everything had value and nothing could be wasted. This careful resource management would require modern people to completely rethink their relationships with material possessions and consumption. The abundance that allows modern people to discard items casually would be replaced by scarcity that demanded careful stewardship of every resource. The medical challenges of medieval life would be perhaps the most serious threat to modern people attempting this lifestyle. Medieval people had shorter lifespans and higher mortality rates partly because of medical limitations that would be dangerous for modern people accustomed to effective medical care. Simple injuries that modern people treat easily could become life-threatening infections without antibiotics. Dental problems that modern people address routinely could cause serious pain and health complications. Even minor illnesses could develop into serious conditions without modern medical interventions. Medieval people did have medical knowledge and treatments that were sometimes effective, but they also relied on remedies that were ineffective or even harmful by modern standards. The trial-and-error approach to medical care would be frightening for modern people accustomed to evidence-based medicine. The psychological impact of living without modern medical security would be significant. Modern people take for granted that most health problems can be treated effectively, that pain can be managed, and that medical emergencies can usually be resolved successfully. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that illness or injury could be fatal despite their best efforts. This medical uncertainty would require psychological adjustments that modern people would find difficult to make. The acceptance of suffering and death as natural parts of life would be necessary for mental health but would conflict with modern expectations of medical solutions to health problems. The childbirth and child-rearing challenges of medieval life would be particularly difficult for modern people to manage. Medieval childbirth was dangerous for both mothers and babies, with mortality rates that would be unacceptable by modern standards. Medieval children who survived birth faced numerous health risks that modern children are protected from through vaccination, nutrition, and medical care. The emotional investment in children had to be balanced by the realistic possibility that many children would not survive to adulthood. Medieval parents developed different relationships with their children that were adapted to these harsh realities. They loved their children deeply but also maintained emotional protection against the grief that child mortality could bring. The educational opportunities available to medieval children were also quite limited compared to modern standards. Most children learned primarily through observation and participation in adult activities rather than through formal schooling. Medieval childhood was shorter than modern childhood, with children taking on adult responsibilities and roles at much younger ages. This early assumption of adult roles provided valuable training but also limited opportunities for play, exploration, and personal development that modern people consider essential for healthy childhood. The aging process in medieval society would also be quite different from modern experience. Medieval people who survived to old age often continued working until they were physically unable to do so because retirement as modern people understand it simply wasn't economically possible. Elderly medieval people were valued for their experience and knowledge, but they also faced physical hardships that modern medical care and social services typically address. The care of elderly family members was a family responsibility that could be emotionally and economically challenging. The death and dying processes in medieval society were also more visible and integrated into daily life than modern people typically experience. Medieval people were more likely to die at home surrounded by family and community rather than in institutional settings. This direct experience with death and dying created different attitudes toward mortality that were both more accepting and more immediate than modern approaches to death. Medieval people developed spiritual and emotional frameworks for dealing with death that helped them find meaning and peace despite the harsh realities of life. The social mobility possibilities in medieval society would be quite limited compared to modern expectations. While some social advancement was possible through military service, religious vocation, or exceptional talent, most people remained in the social class they were born into throughout their lives. This social stability provided security and predictability but also limited individual ambition and achievement in ways that modern people might find frustrating. The modern expectation that hard work and talent should lead to social advancement would be repeatedly disappointed in a world where birth circumstances largely determined life opportunities. Medieval people found meaning and satisfaction within their social positions rather than through social advancement. The acceptance of social hierarchy as natural and permanent was psychologically necessary but would conflict with modern values of equality and individual achievement. The community celebrations and festivals that marked medieval life would provide some compensation for the daily hardships, but they would also require participation in social and religious activities that modern people might find constraining. Medieval festivals were community events that required everyone to participate in ways that reinforced social bonds and shared values. These celebrations provided entertainment, social connection, and emotional release that were essential for community mental health. But medieval celebrations also reinforced social hierarchies and religious beliefs that modern people might find objectionable. The community pressure to participate in celebrations that conflicted with personal beliefs or preferences would be another area where individual autonomy would be constrained by community expectations. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval celebrations would also be quite different from modern holiday schedules. Medieval festivals were tied to agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and community needs in ways that created meaningful connections between celebration and daily life. As this long meditation on medieval life draws toward its conclusion, the overwhelming impression would be of the enormous complexity and difficulty of surviving in a world so different from our own. Every aspect of daily life that modern people take for granted would require skills, knowledge, and attitudes that would take years to develop. The romantic notion of simpler times would be quickly dispelled by the harsh realities of physical hardship, social constraint, and constant uncertainty that characterized medieval existence. But medieval people did find ways to create meaningful, satisfying lives within these constraints, and they developed sources of joy and fulfillment that modern people might find valuable and inspiring. The question of whether you could survive a day in medieval times isn't just about physical endurance or practical skills, it's about psychological adaptation to a completely different way of understanding and experiencing human existence. The answer would depend on your ability to develop new relationships with community, nature, spirituality, and mortality that are quite different from modern assumptions about life. The question of whether you could survive a day in medieval times isn't just about physical endurance or practical skills, it's about psychological adaptation to a completely different way of understanding and experiencing human existence. The answer would depend on your ability to develop new relationships with community, nature, spirituality, and mortality that are quite different from modern assumptions about life. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through a single medieval day, it's worth reflecting on what this exploration reveals about both medieval life and modern existence. The challenges that would defeat most modern people in medieval times aren't primarily about technology or material comfort, they're about fundamental differences in how people understood their place in the world and their relationships with each other. Medieval people lived with levels of uncertainty, discomfort, and hardship that would seem intolerable to modern sensibilities, but they also had sources of meaning, community support, and spiritual comfort that many modern people lack. They were embedded in social networks that provided security and identity but also constrained individual choice and personal expression. The independence that modern people value so highly would be revealed as a form of isolation in the medieval context. The individual autonomy that we consider essential for human dignity would be replaced by interdependence that could be both supportive and constraining. Medieval people understood that survival required community cooperation, acceptance of social obligations, and adaptation to natural cycles in ways that modern people often resist. They developed psychological resilience through acceptance of limited control over their circumstances while working diligently within those constraints. The work-life balance that medieval peasants enjoyed, despite the hardships, came from integration rather than separation. Work, family, community, and spiritual life were woven together in ways that created meaning and purpose even during difficult periods. There was no commute to separate home from work, no artificial division between productive time and personal time. Medieval people worked when work was necessary and rested when rest was possible, following natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules. This created a more humane relationship with labor, even though the labor itself was more physically demanding than most modern work. The seasonal variations that governed medieval life also created natural periods of intense activity and restful recovery that modern industrial schedules often don't accommodate. Medieval people understood that human energy and motivation fluctuate naturally, and they organized their lives around these cycles rather than fighting against them. The water that would probably kill you before any plague reflects another fundamental difference between medieval and modern life. Medieval people lived in intimate contact with their environment in ways that created both vulnerability and deep knowledge. They understood local ecosystems, weather patterns, and natural resources with sophistication that modern people rarely develop. But this intimate environmental relationship also meant that environmental problems had immediate personal consequences. Contaminated water, failed crops, severe weather, and other environmental challenges couldn't be buffered by technology, infrastructure, or global supply chains. Medieval people developed remarkable skills for reading environmental signs and adapting to natural conditions, but they also accepted that humans were subject to natural forces rather than masters of them. This humility before nature was both psychologically healthy and practically necessary for survival. The armor that knights wore primarily for social display rather than protection illustrates another fundamental difference between medieval and modern societies. Medieval people lived in a world where social status was immediately visible through clothing, possessions, and behavior in ways that everyone could read and interpret. Modern people often complain about superficial status displays, but medieval society was much more explicitly hierarchical and status-conscious than contemporary culture. Everyone knew their place in the social order, and this knowledge provided both security and constraint that modern people might find difficult to navigate. The elaborate armor, expensive clothing, and other status symbols served important social functions by making hierarchies visible and stable. While modern people might find this system unfair or oppressive, it also provided social order and predictability that reduced certain types of conflict and uncertainty. Medieval people found dignity and meaning within their social positions rather than through social mobility. The acceptance of hierarchy as natural and permanent was psychologically necessary for social stability but would conflict with modern values of equality and individual achievement. The gradual realization that would dawn on any modern person experiencing medieval life is that almost every modern convenience we take for granted represents a solution to problems that medieval people had to solve through human effort, community cooperation, and personal adaptation. Our electric lights replaced the dangerous, expensive, and dim illumination that made medieval evenings challenging. Our climate control systems replaced the constant fire management that occupied so much medieval time and attention. Our food distribution systems replaced the seasonal uncertainties and preservation challenges that made medieval nutrition precarious. Our medical systems replaced the suffering and early mortality that medieval people accepted as inevitable. Our transportation networks replaced the isolation and limited mobility that constrained medieval lives. Our information systems replaced the ignorance and limited communication that made medieval decision-making so difficult. But each of these technological solutions has also created new problems and dependencies that medieval people didn't face. The complexity of modern systems creates vulnerabilities that medieval people didn't have to worry about. The pace of modern change creates stress and uncertainty that medieval stability avoided. The psychological frameworks that medieval people developed for dealing with hardship, uncertainty, and mortality might be valuable for modern people facing different but equally challenging circumstances. The acceptance of suffering as part of life, the reliance on community support during difficult times, and the integration of spiritual meaning into daily experience are approaches that could benefit modern mental health. Medieval people also had different relationships with time that might be healthier than modern time anxiety. They understood that some things cannot be rushed, that natural processes have their own rhythms, and that human well-being requires periods of rest and reflection that productivity culture often doesn't accommodate. The community obligations that constrained medieval individual freedom also provided social support and shared responsibility that many modern people lack. The isolation and loneliness that characterize modern life would have been impossible in medieval communities where everyone was embedded in multiple overlapping social networks. Medieval people knew their neighbors, depended on their families, and participated in community institutions in ways that created social resilience and mutual support. These relationships came with obligations and constraints, but they also provided security and meaning that purely voluntary modern relationships sometimes lack. The spiritual dimensions of medieval life provided frameworks for understanding suffering, mortality, and purpose that many modern people struggle to find. Whether or not modern people share medieval religious beliefs, the integration of spiritual practice into daily life created sources of comfort and meaning that purely secular approaches sometimes can't replicate. Medieval people faced their mortality directly and regularly in ways that helped them appreciate life and maintain perspective on daily problems. Modern people, who are often shielded from death and dying, sometimes lack the psychological preparation for dealing with loss and limitation that medieval people developed through necessity. As our long medieval day finally comes to its end and you would be settling into that uncomfortable straw mattress for another night of interrupted sleep, the overwhelming lesson would be about human adaptability and resilience. Medieval people created meaningful, dignified lives under conditions that modern people would find intolerable, and they did so through skills, attitudes, and social systems that modern people have largely forgotten. The question isn't whether medieval life was better or worse than modern life. Both have advantages and disadvantages that reflect different trade-offs and priorities. The question is what modern people can learn from medieval approaches to community, work, environment, and meaning that might enrich contemporary life without requiring abandonment of modern benefits. Medieval people understood that human happiness and dignity don't require constant comfort, unlimited choices, or individual autonomy. They found satisfaction in community belonging, meaningful work, spiritual purpose, and acceptance of natural limits that modern people often resist. But they also lived with levels of physical hardship, social constraint, and personal vulnerability that most modern people would find unacceptable. The challenge is finding ways to capture the benefits of medieval social cohesion and psychological resilience while maintaining modern gains in health, security, and individual freedom. This gentle exploration of medieval life has been designed to help you appreciate both the comforts of modern existence and the wisdom embedded in older ways of living. As you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, protected by modern medicine, fed by global agriculture, and warmed by efficient heating systems, you can feel grateful for these benefits while also reflecting on what medieval people knew about community, resilience, and meaning that might enrich modern life. The medieval world was harsh and challenging in ways that would test the limits of human endurance, but it was also a world where people found deep sources of purpose, connection, and spiritual meaning that sustained them through difficulties that would overwhelm many modern people. Perhaps the most important lesson from our medieval day is that human beings are remarkably adaptable and can find ways to create meaningful lives under almost any circumstances. The skills and attitudes that enable this adaptability, community cooperation, acceptance of limitation, spiritual resilience, and appreciation for simple pleasures are as valuable today as they were 700 years ago. Sleep well, knowing that your ancestors survived and thrived under conditions that would challenge you in ways you've never imagined, and that their wisdom and resilience live on in you. The comfortable bed you're lying in, the safe walls that surround you, and the peaceful night that embraces you are gifts that would have seemed miraculous to medieval people. And they represent the accumulated efforts of countless generations who worked to make life easier for those who came after them. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be peaceful and undisturbed by church bells, fleas, or the constant vigilance that medieval survival required. Tomorrow you'll wake up in the modern world, but tonight you've traveled through time to understand just how remarkable that modern world really is and how much human wisdom and resilience it took to create the comfort and security you now enjoy.